They said it was evil, they said it was dark. But behind the whispers of witchcraft lies a world of wisdom that guided African communities for centuries. What we call superstition today was once the backbone of survival, healing, and identity. Across the continent, rituals that connected people to their ancestors and the forces of nature were reduced to fear-driven labels. Spiritual leaders became villains in their own land, and sacred traditions were dismissed as dangerous magic. But who drew this line, and why? The truth is, African spirituality has always been more than what outsiders have called it. It was never simply spells, curses, or charms. It was an entire system of knowledge, a way to live in harmony with the earth, the spirits, and each other. To understand how it was misrepresented, we need to peel back the layers of history and uncover the stories that were deliberately hidden. For generations, communities sought guidance from diviners and healers who were seen not as sorcerers, but as custodians of wisdom. These figures helped settle disputes, heal the sick, and maintain balance between the visible and the invisible world. Yet, over time, their roles were twisted into something sinister, stripped of their dignity, and recast as witchcraft. This distortion wasn't accidental. When colonizers and missionaries arrived, they saw African traditions as a threat to their power. To weaken the people, they had to weaken their culture. Branding sacred practices as witchcraft created fear, division, and shame. What was once respected became a source of ridicule, and slowly, generations began to lose touch with the truths of their own heritage. But African spirituality never disappeared. It survived in whispers, in secret rituals, in the songs and dances that carried meaning only to those who understood. Beneath the surface of everyday life, the old traditions continued to flow like an underground river, hidden but never fully gone. And now, more than ever, people are beginning to ask, what really separates witchcraft from tradition? Take, for example, the story of a village healer in West Africa. For decades, she was known for curing illnesses with herbs and guiding families through rituals of protection. But when missionaries arrived, her practice was branded as witchcraft. Overnight, a respected grandmother became an outcast. Her knowledge of plants, spirits, and the human soul was dismissed as devilish, even though the same people who condemned her still sought her help in secret when modern medicine failed. This is the paradox African spirituality has lived with for generations, honored in silence, condemned in public. This question is not as simple as it seems. In African contexts, witchcraft was never just about casting spells. It often meant practices believed to cause harm, selfishness, or imbalance in the community. Tradition, on the other hand, was about restoring balance, protecting the vulnerable, and connecting the living with the ancestors. Somewhere along the way, these lines were blurred, sometimes by outsiders, and sometimes by those who misunderstood their own heritage. As we begin this journey, think of it as lifting a veil. We'll look at the origins of African spirituality long before colonial rule, examine how religion and politics rewrote its meaning, and uncover how modern Africans are reclaiming their spiritual identity. This isn't about glorifying or condemning, but about seeing clearly what has long been covered in shadow. By the end of this video, you'll understand why what many dismiss as superstition is, in fact, a library of wisdom, resilience, and spirituality. And perhaps you'll start to question how much of what we believe about African traditions is truth, and how much is a carefully crafted illusion. Long before the arrival of missionaries and colonizers, African spirituality was not a set of random rituals, it was a way of life. Every community had a spiritual foundation that shaped how people farmed, hunted, governed, and even healed the sick. To the people, the physical world and the spiritual world were not separate realms. They were two sides of the same coin, constantly interacting. Across the continent, there were many traditions, yet they shared certain patterns. Ancestors were seen as vital links between the living and the divine. Nature was not a lifeless backdrop, but a living partner. Rivers, forests, mountains, and animals were respected as sacred entities with spirits of their own. Spirituality was not about fear, it was about balance, respect, and continuity. In West Africa, the Yoruba people developed the Ifa system, an intricate spiritual practice rooted in divination, symbolism, and oral wisdom. Ifa priests, known as Babalawos, acted as interpreters of destiny, guiding individuals and communities in times of uncertainty. Their role was not to manipulate, but to reveal paths, helping people align their actions with universal order. This wasn't witchcraft, it was a philosophy of life. To understand how central this was, imagine a young farmer approaching a babalawo during a season of drought. The diviner would cast sacred palm nuts, interpret patterns, and deliver guidance not just about rainfall, but about the farmer's responsibilities to his ancestors and community. The ritual was less about magic and more about accountability, reminding the farmer that survival depended on both practical work and spiritual alignment. This blend of ethics, ecology, and spirituality reveals how deeply connected African life was to its spiritual systems. Among the Zulu of southern Africa, the Sangomas held a similar role. These healers connected with ancestral spirits through dreams, trances, and rituals. Far from being seen as sinister, they were trusted advisors and protectors of the community. Their knowledge of plants, bones, and ritual chants was a blend of medicine and spirituality, ensuring both body and soul remained healthy. In the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians built one of the most sophisticated spiritual systems in history, with Ma'at as the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. The idea of living in harmony with Ma'at was not only spiritual but political, influencing how rulers governed and how justice was delivered. What we now call law or ethics was deeply tied to spiritual belief. Even smaller communities had their own unique practices. The Dagara people of Burkina Faso, for instance, held fire rituals to restore balance during communal conflicts. The Maasai of East Africa honored Enkai, the god of the sky, through prayers tied to rain and cattle, the lifeblood of their survival. Each practice was designed to sustain harmony with the environment, the ancestors, and the unseen forces shaping daily life. One important truth often forgotten is that African spirituality was not static. It was dynamic, flexible, and deeply rooted in oral tradition. Wisdom was passed from elders to youth through stories, proverbs, songs, and ceremonies. A proverb in the Akan tradition says, "Wisdom is like a baobab tree. No one individual can embrace it." Such sayings were not entertainment. They were living laws, teaching the community how to respect elders, live honestly, and protect the vulnerable. Another striking feature was its communal nature. In many African societies, spirituality was not confined to temples or shrines. It was in the rhythm of drums during festivals, in the planting seasons of farmers, in the initiation rites of young men and women. Spirituality lived in the everyday. Everyone participated. No one was excluded. It wasn't a private affair. It was the fabric of society itself. But here's what makes it fascinating. Even when harmful practices appeared, communities had mechanisms to distinguish them from sacred traditions. Sorcery, using spiritual power to harm, was condemned and punished, while healing and ancestral reverence were celebrated. This shows that African societies already understood the difference between destructive witchcraft and constructive spirituality. That line only became blurred later. Understanding these origins is crucial because it reveals the depth and sophistication of African spirituality. It was never primitive, never chaotic, never the caricature painted by outsiders. It was a holistic worldview, uniting medicine, philosophy, law, and ethics under a spiritual umbrella. The people lived by it, died by it, and passed it on as their greatest inheritance. This foundation is what colonial powers would later attack, distort, and suppress. But before we get to that story, it is important to recognize the beauty and resilience of what existed first. African spirituality was not witchcraft. It was tradition, order, and the very heart of civilization itself. When Europeans arrived on African soil, they brought with them more than trade and technology. They carried a worldview that could not comprehend the depth of African spirituality. To them, the drumming, the chanting, the sacrifices, and the ancestral invocations were not expressions of faith, they were signs of darkness. And so began the campaign of demonization. Missionaries were often the first agents of this change. They presented Christianity not just as a new religion, but as the only path to civilization. Anything outside its doctrine was painted as paganism, witchcraft, or devil worship. African spiritual leaders, once honored as healers, teachers, and judges, were branded as sorcerers. Shrines were burned, sacred objects destroyed, and followers shamed into abandoning their traditions. This was not just about religion, it was about power. Colonial governments quickly learned that to rule effectively, they had to dismantle the systems that held communities together. African spirituality, with its emphasis on communal values and ancestral authority, gave people identity and resilience. By labeling it as evil, colonizers weakened cultural unity and made it easier to impose foreign rule. One of the strongest weapons in this campaign was fear. Stories of witchcraft were exaggerated and manipulated to create panic. If a child fell sick, missionaries would claim it was the result of witches. If drought struck, they declared the gods of Africa powerless. Slowly, generations were taught to distrust their own healers and to turn instead to imported faiths for protection and answers. But the demonization went deeper. Laws were passed to criminalize traditional practices. In many colonies, divination, herbal medicine, or initiation ceremonies were outlawed under witchcraft suppression acts. What had been a way of life for centuries was suddenly illegal. Those who dared to continue practicing were driven underground, their roles twisted into something sinister by both colonial courts and local converts. Take the case of South Africa. The Sangomas, once pillars of community health, were recast as witch doctors in colonial literature. The very word became a tool of mockery and fear. Instead of being respected as mediators between the living and the ancestors, they were reduced to caricatures in newspapers and missionary reports. A respected institution was transformed into an object of ridicule. In Nigeria, the Ifa system of the Yoruba suffered a similar fate. Colonizers and missionaries dismissed the complex divination system as superstition. Sacred groves, once thriving centers of spirituality and ecology, were cut down in the name of progress. The priests, who had guided generations with wisdom, were painted as manipulators of dark forces. The richness of the system was deliberately flattened into a stereotype of witchcraft. This demonization wasn't accidental, it was strategic. By destroying the spiritual backbone of societies, colonizers created dependency. People were taught to look to churches for morality, to courts for justice, and to Western medicine for healing. What they once found within their traditions, they were now forced to seek from the institutions of the colonizer. This shift gave colonial powers unprecedented control, not only over the land, but over the very soul of the people. The psychological damage was profound. Children grew up ashamed of their heritage. Elders were silenced or ignored. Communities that once thrived on collective rituals began to see division, as converts looked down upon those who still clung to ancestral ways. What had once been a source of pride became a source of stigma. And yet, even under the weight of this oppression, African spirituality did not vanish. It adapted. It hid in songs, dances, and coded language. In some cases, it blended with Christianity and Islam, creating syncretic traditions that carried old wisdom under new names. In others, it went underground, practiced in secret, and passed quietly from one generation to the next. But the damage was done. By the time colonial powers withdrew, the perception of African spirituality had been permanently altered. Even today, many Africans view their own traditions with suspicion, echoing the narratives planted by missionaries centuries ago. Witchcraft became a catch-all label, while the richness of spiritual traditions was forgotten. This deliberate distortion is why the line between witchcraft and tradition seems so blurry now. It was colonialism that painted them with the same brush, erasing the distinctions that once existed. What was once sacred became sinister, not because of truth, but because of strategy. As we move forward, we'll uncover that thin line more closely. We'll see how communities themselves distinguish between harmful sorcery and sacred tradition, and why understanding this difference is the key to reclaiming the truth about African spirituality. When people hear the word witchcraft, images of curses, dark rituals, and malicious powers immediately come to mind. But in the African context, the story is more complex. The word witchcraft was never originally part of African languages. It was an imported concept, forced onto diverse practices that were not the same. What Africans once distinguished carefully between good and harmful practices became muddled under one foreign label. Traditionally, African communities recognized two forms of spiritual power: the power that maintained harmony and the power that disrupted it. One was respected, the other feared. Healers, diviners, and herbalists used their gifts to protect life, restore balance, and cure illness. Sorcerers, however, were believed to use spiritual force for greed, revenge, or destruction. Both existed, but they were not seen as the same. Take the Yoruba worldview as an example. A Babalawo was a priest who guided communities with wisdom, interpreting destiny through Ifa. His role was sacred and celebrated. But someone accused of Aje, a witch who caused harm through hidden powers, was seen as a threat to the community. These categories were distinct, yet colonial narratives flattened them into one frightening word: witchcraft. Among the Zulu, the same line was drawn. Sangomas, respected as healers and spiritual guides, were valued members of society. Yet individuals suspected of Ubuthakathi, using magic to harm others, were condemned. This distinction was clear in language, ritual, and law. But once colonizers labeled all these practices witchcraft, the cultural nuance was erased, leaving a legacy of confusion that persists to this day. The irony is that African societies had systems of justice to deal with harmful witchcraft long before colonial courts arrived. Communities held trials, rituals of cleansing, and protective ceremonies to address accusations. While some practices were harsh, the underlying principle was accountability. Spiritual power should serve the community, not destroy it. This shows that Africans did not blindly accept all spiritual acts, they judged them by their impact. The tragedy is that when colonial powers lumped healers and sorcerers together, they turned guardians into villains. Herbalists, who preserved knowledge of thousands of medicinal plants, were mocked as witches. Diviners, who settled disputes and guided leaders, were branded as tricksters. The careful balance between sacred tradition and destructive witchcraft was erased in the public imagination. And yet, within African spirituality itself, the line was always there. In Ghana, shrine priests were seen as intermediaries between humans and the gods, safeguarding the community's moral order. But those accused of using charms to curse others were cast out or punished. In Kenya, elders differentiated between sacred rituals to honor ancestors and harmful acts of jealousy disguised as magic. Across Africa, the distinction was clear. One built life, the other destroyed it. To truly understand this thin line, we must look at intention. Tradition was rooted in life, protection, and continuity. Witchcraft, in its destructive sense, was rooted in selfishness, secrecy, and fear. The same rituals, pouring libations, invoking spirits, using herbs, could be seen in both, but the difference was purpose. One preserved, the other corrupted. A story from East Africa illustrates this. In a village struck by illness, a healer prepared herbs, invoked the ancestors, and restored health to many. He was praised for his gift. Yet in the same village, a man accused of poisoning neighbors with charms was labeled a witch and feared. Both used spiritual means, but one for healing, the other for harm. This is the thin line, visible in intention, invisible to outsiders. The blurring of this line is why African spirituality still struggles for recognition today. When outsiders failed to understand these distinctions, they painted all traditions with the same brush. And when colonial and missionary narratives amplified this confusion, generations grew up fearing even the practices that once sustained their people. But reclaiming the truth means acknowledging that Africans themselves always knew the difference. Tradition was about order, healing, and connection. Witchcraft in its harmful form was about chaos, destruction, and greed. To merge them into one word was not just a mistake, it was a deliberate strategy that robbed people of their heritage. As we peel back the layers, the truth becomes clear. African spirituality was never synonymous with witchcraft. It was, and still is, a sophisticated system of knowledge, healing, and ethics. Witchcraft existed, yes, but it was a different path. One communities condemned. Knowing the difference is not just history, it's the key to reclaiming African identity today. For centuries, African spirituality was forced into the shadows, but today, it is rising again. Across the continent and throughout the diaspora, more people are reclaiming the practices once dismissed as superstition. From the rhythm of ancestral drumming to the quiet power of herbal medicine, traditions are being revived with a new sense of pride. This revival is not about nostalgia, it's about identity. For young Africans, reconnecting with spirituality is a way of healing from the damage of colonialism. It's a way of saying, we are not ashamed of who we are. In cities like Lagos, Johannesburg, and Accra, spiritual practitioners are no longer just hidden in rural villages. They are part of urban life, blending tradition with modernity. Music has played a powerful role in this resurgence. Afrobeat, hip-hop, and even gospel artists weave spiritual themes into their lyrics. References to ancestors, orishas, and sacred rituals appear in songs streamed worldwide. These messages reach young audiences who might never have set foot in a shrine, but who find strength in knowing their culture carries deep spiritual roots. In the diaspora, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Latinos are also looking back to these traditions. Many have turned to Ifa, Vodun, and other practices to fill the spiritual gaps left by centuries of displacement. For them, embracing African spirituality is not just about ritual, it's about reconnecting with a stolen heritage. This has created a global movement where African traditions are honored far beyond the continent itself. But this revival has not been without tension. Christianity and Islam remain dominant religions across Africa, and many believers still view traditional spirituality with suspicion. In some cases, the old colonial mindset persists. Anything outside mainstream faith is branded as witchcraft. Yet despite opposition, a growing number of Africans are finding ways to practice both, blending church, mosque, and ancestral altar into one spiritual journey. Technology has also changed everything. Social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube are now filled with young Africans sharing proverbs, rituals, and ancestral wisdom. What was once whispered in secret is now trending online, gaining millions of views. This digital renaissance has given African spirituality new visibility, allowing it to be celebrated instead of silenced. A striking example is the popularity of herbal medicine. For centuries, it was dismissed as primitive compared to Western pharmaceuticals. Today, even modern doctors are acknowledging the value of traditional remedies. Communities are rediscovering the knowledge of plants and their healing powers, wisdom that elders guarded for generations. What was mocked as witchcraft is now recognized as science rooted in tradition. This modern revival shows us something important. African spirituality was never destroyed. It was suppressed, ridiculed, and hidden, but it endured. And now it's being reimagined for a new world, one where tradition and modernity can walk side by side. The key message is this: African spirituality is not stuck in the past. It is alive, evolving, and shaping the present. From the beat of the drum to the glow of a smartphone screen, it continues to remind us that identity, balance, and connection are timeless truths. For too long, the world has confused African spirituality with witchcraft. What was once a source of wisdom, healing, and identity was twisted into something to be feared. Colonial powers blurred the line deliberately, stripping communities of their dignity and replacing respect with suspicion. But the truth has always been there, waiting to be seen. We've uncovered the origins of African spirituality, where ancestors, nature, and rituals formed the pillars of daily life. We've seen how colonial forces demonized these traditions, turning sacred leaders into outcasts. And we've drawn the thin line between destructive sorcery and sacred tradition, two paths that Africans themselves always knew were different. Today, the revival of African spirituality shows us that this wisdom cannot be erased. It has adapted, survived, and returned in new forms, through music, medicine, rituals, and the voices of a new generation. What some still call superstition is, in reality, a living philosophy that has shaped civilizations for thousands of years. So the next time someone uses the word witchcraft as a blanket label, remember this: African spirituality was never about fear. It was about balance, harmony, and the deep connection between the living and the unseen. Witchcraft existed, yes, but it was never the whole story. The whole story is one of resilience, survival, and truth. If this journey has opened your eyes, don't let it stop here. Share this video so more people can challenge the myths. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What part of African spirituality do you think the world misunderstands the most? And if you want to keep uncovering hidden histories and powerful truths, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because this conversation is not just about the past, it's about the future. The more we understand where we come from, the stronger we become in shaping where we are going.